not hitting sales quota for the month and reducing their hours if they wanted to work more, like in a full-time and part-time.
Okay, all right. So provided they do a good job of selling, right? Provided they continue those good behaviors, you remove the unpleasant thing, which is the wrong kind of schedule for them? Is that?
Well, like some people want to increase their hours and move from part-time to full-time in retail a lot of the times.
Okay.
And if they hit their quotas, employers would be more willing to bump their hours.
Okay, and so the unpleasant thing that you're removing is the bad hours, right? Or something like that? Yeah. So, okay, and that can be thought of as an example of negative reinforcement. You're removing the unpleasant hours, schedule, something about their job that is currently unpleasant, or at least you offer to. Then you make the contract and you say, provided you do hit your sales quota, provided you continue to do a good job, I'll remove that negative aspect of your job and replace it with something positive. And by the way, that replacement is positive reinforcement, right? The removal of the negative thing is negative reinforcement. Okay? What else is something negative? Something unpleasant that you might, I shouldn't say negative. Something unpleasant that you might remove. Think of other examples?
Well, I'm not sure if that actually applies. I was thinking like the way they make like a casual day, like casual Friday, by removing having to dress up.
Okay.
To make employees a little happier.
Okay, there you go. So removing that unpleasant issue. Any others? Those are good, yeah. And it could be anything unpleasant, right? It could be, the person finds, that their coworkers are difficult to work with. You could say, okay, if you're having trouble with your coworkers, if you continue to engage in these good behaviors, I pledge to move you to a different team, or something like that. Maybe as a manager, you're a yeller. Maybe most of us are not yellers, but some managers yell at their employees. Not encouraged, of course, but some do. Your employees probably don't like being yelled at, and so you might say, look, okay, provided you do the right kind of behaviors, I pledge to stop yelling at you, right? Just an example, right? Of negative reinforcement. Okay, so that's the reinforcement side, the positive and negative elements. Once again, the main reason why we talk about this, it's still the same principle. People do what's rewarded, people don't do what's punished. We haven't talked about punishment yet. People do what's rewarded. And it just gives you a little bit of, added categories to apply more creative thought to how you might use reinforcement principles to motivate. Don't forget about the negative side when you're thinking about reinforcement. The punishment side of the house, right, is where you're trying to decrease the probability of some undesired behavior. And again, for most of us, we think about positive punishment quite easily, right? So we're trying to get rid of some undesired behavior, like what? Peeing your pants. A common problem in the workplace. Okay. It's not a bad. I almost went with it just because it was a funny, unusual answer. But how about we go with lateness, right? Someone's late. Someone's late to their meetings, maybe because they had to change their pants or for whatever reason. So you're trying to extinguish that behavior. You get people to stop showing up late to the meeting, and one way to do it is through the positive side of punishment. Here you're adding something unpleasant in order to get rid of that. I'm not going to get that out of my head. Get rid of that behavior, whichever one you want to focus on. So what's an example of something unpleasant that you might do, or at least threaten to do? Often just the threat is sufficient. Yeah.
Our group has a policy doing it.
Okay, there you go. So presumably on unpleasant event, you have to use your own money to bring donuts. Not everybody would do that as unpleasant, but yeah, reasonably an example of positive punishment. Yeah, pretty much any time in the workplace when you use sort of, what are typical human resource kinds of actions, you give somebody a warning, you give somebody, reprimands, demotions, leave without pay, even threats of termination, all of those fall into the category of positive punishment. You're adding something unpleasant, like a leave of absence without pay or something unpleasant in order to get rid of whatever undesirable behavior you're trying to get rid of. So once again, for most of us, it's pretty easy to think about examples of positive punishment in the workplace. Where people often have a little more trouble, I think, thinking creatively is in the world of negative punishment. Well, let's cover that. You're still trying to get rid of that undesired behavior, whatever it may be, but you're doing it now by removing something that's negative, right? So you're taking something away. In this case, removing something positive. Okay? So if we stick with the example of lateness to a meeting, What's an example of something pleasant that you might take away? And again, often just the threat is sufficient. But what's an example? Negative punishment. Yes. Okay. A bonus would be a good example, right? Employees often think about their bonus as sort of a birthright. You know, I deserve this bonus somehow. You know, don't you? You could never take it away from me. Most managers don't do it that way. Most managers view bonuses as basically discretionary. You know, provided you do the right things or don't do the wrong things, you know, you'll get your bonus. But yeah. So an example of negative punishment: if you don't stop being late for meetings, you know, I will at least threaten you to remove that bonus. An example of a negative punishment. Yeah, and again, almost anything pleasant can be potentially, taken away from an employee. A negative punishment can often be quite effective. Again, often just the threat is sufficient. You often don't have to follow up. You should be prepared to follow up if necessary, but often you'll get your employee's attention just fine, by a suggestion of some form of negative punishment. So good. You guys get the idea. Again, reinforcement theory is quite simple. People do what's rewarded. People don't do what's punished. And here's just a little bit of information to help you, make those kinds of calls. How can I use reinforcement theory? How can I stimulate some various ideas? Don't forget that there are 4 different contingencies of reinforcement: positive and negative punishment, positive and negative reinforcement. Christine? I'm sorry, Christine. Okay. Yeah. Just first of all, to respond to your question, the same action can often be put into different categories depending on how you look at it. All right. And so let's go ahead and bring your example again. We used as an example of positive punishment the example of what again? Leave without pay. Right. So you can think about that in terms of a positive punishment. That what you're adding is this negative event, right? This thing called leave without pay. So when you think of it that way, we would call it a positive punishment. But as your question, very nicely brings out, you can think about that same action differently. You could be taking away their pay, which is a pleasant thing, right? And in that case, that would be an example of negative punishment. Does that make sense? Or you can think of it as, the leave, where you force a leave on somebody, right? You can think of that as adding something unpleasant, right? You're forcing them to get away from the company. For most people, that's not considered to be a good thing, right? Being kind of kicked out of the company for a while. So you're adding something unpleasant, right? But you could also think about that leave, as potentially removing something pleasant. Let me make sure that makes sense. Sometimes I get myself confused. Removing something pleasant, I think you can do that as a negative punishment. So anyway, how you look at something, you can put it into a different category. And so what you're describing is absolutely on the money, and I would encourage you to, play with some examples and think about how the same behavior could fall on the positive or negative side of certain categories.
Point out the example that you were talking about reinforcement.
Yes.
Where if you remove someone from their current group, put them in a different one, you're taking them away, but you're also putting them into a positive situation.
There you go. Yeah, very good. Another good example of what we're describing. Yeah, so again, the point here is to stimulate creativity, to think about various contingencies, and the same behavior might fall in different categories depending on how you frame it. Right? Very good. Okay, so that's the simplicity of reinforcement theory. It's really not complicated. So that's kind of check. Covered number 1. It's a pretty simple approach. Number 2, it's a very powerful approach. And I mentioned to you that some would view, reinforcement theory as the greatest management principle in the world. There's a book by book that I'll quickly summarize for you that makes that claim. Some of you may be familiar with, for example, the 1-Minute Manager. Another, sort of major books in the world of leadership and management. One of the 3, actually 2 of the 3 principles that are brought in the 1-Minute Manager are reinforcement theory. So, it's pretty widespread belief. I think this is an extremely powerful approach. And the basic point of this book, brings out the power. It's the power of this way of doing things. It's the things that get rewarded are the things that get done. in organizations and in life. So if you think about the things that people do inside organizations, you know, it could be good behaviors, you know, good performance kinds of activities, you know, like good sales activity. It can even be odd behaviors, or even unethical behaviors. You know, whatever behavior you're talking about inside the workplace, chances are there's some kind of, you know, some kind of reward or punishment, some kind of, you know, reinforcement or punishment going on that's driving that behavior. When you mentioned kids, right? You take your kid to the supermarket and the kid's, you know, screaming for candy. You know, if you give the kid candy, should you be surprised if the kid screams for candy again next time? Of course not. They'll probably scream twice as loud next time because they've been rewarded for it, right? They've been rewarded for their screaming game. The things that get rewarded are the things that get done, whether it's in organizations or parenting or outside life. And so that's that example of that, you know, the kid at the candy at the supermarket, you know, is relevant to some of the things that the book talks about. He says too often organizations, meaning managers, engage in what he calls counterproductive behaviors. Right? Basically, rewarding the wrong kinds of things in organizations. Examples he gives would be giving raises to employees who threaten to leave. This is a pretty common one. And you can imagine yourself, maybe you've been in this scenario, right, where an employee storms into your office, and you're a manager, and the person basically threatens to leave. You know, give me a raise, or I'm out. What do you do? Put you in a tough spot. And I'm not going to say that what I'm about to advocate is universally true, because there's a lot to consider, right, when that situation happens to you. The point that the book makes, though, and the point that I would make here is, let's say that you say yes. You give in, you acquiesce, you say, okay, you know, here's a 10% raise. You got to ask yourself, what did I just do? You know, what did I just reward in that situation? And what did you just reward by acquiescing?
They're holding the power. But then again, I mean, you have to also, if they come at you with a valid argument, like, hey, you know, I've been increasing profits by 10% for the last, you know, 9 months, and you know, I'm not getting a taste of that at all. You know, whereas, you know, like you get, so it depends on how they come at you with it. But if someone's, for the most part, if someone just wants more money, they're going to leave anyways.
Yes, and there actually is data to support that. Data suggesting, different studies will say slightly different things, but I think kind of the center of this research suggests that in the neighborhood of 50% of employees who do this, who come in demanding more money and threaten to leave, approximately 50% of them are gone within a year, even if you give them the raise, right? Which speaks to your point. A lot of times I think managers and employees both get confused about the rewarding power of money. If an employee walks into your office demanding money, sometimes they really want money, but as often as not, they really want something else, something that they're not getting. Even if you give them the raise, they often leave anyway because they're not getting something else. Often unknown what that something else is, but something besides money. Yeah.
The pay difference between men and women is like 70 cents in the dollar.
Yeah.
When men and women start out, they usually make the same amount of money, but the difference in pay that ends up happening is because men are the ones who go in and make demands more often, and are more consistent about it, about doing this, and even though they're the same level of work performance, but just because they are more demanding.
Yeah. Interesting literature on that topic as well. But yeah, so again, kind of getting back to my question, what are you rewarding if you do that? At least arguably you're rewarding what we might call squeaky wheel behavior, right? Squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? There's Sarah's point to bring out. And so again, just like the kid at the supermarket, should you be surprised if that employee comes back 3 months later and does it again? The person just got rewarded for coming in and demanding a raise. Should you be surprised if other employees come into your office demanding a raise? And no, because people talk, right? Word spreads and people find out, hey, wow, that behavior apparently gets rewarded around here. Well, they'll do it also. So again, I'm not suggesting, as Evan's pointing out, that you never give the person a raise in that situation. There are always exceptions. But you got to be careful. You got to ask yourself, you know, what can of worms am I opening here? Is it really worth it? If this person is just your star employee, you know, your job as a manager is going to greatly suffer or maybe fall apart if that person leaves. You know, maybe you have no choice, right? for the most part, what I found, at least in my experience, is that you can effectively handle that kind of situation by basically, having a heart-to-heart talk with that employee and saying, look, I appreciate what you're saying, again, leveraging the point of appreciation. People want to feel appreciated. So having a hopefully sincere conversation about how much you do appreciate what that employee is contributing to the work environment, but that they have to understand your situation as a manager, right? That doing that, just jumping up and giving that person a raise is going to take you out of your normal performance appraisal cycle. Most organizations will have cycles where you get every 6 months you get a formal appraisal, or every year, or whatever. Followed up by raises. Hopefully, if the organization has enough money to back it up with raises, and that the employee has to understand that you do value them, but that they've got to wait for the regular performance appraisal cycle like everybody else. But then when it comes around, you pledge to do whatever you can as a manager, to give them as much of a raise as you can get them, as much as they deserve, however you want to phrase it. But that kind of conversation, I think, works. Again, it's often not necessarily about money in that conversation anyway. So by having that kind of sincere heart-to-heart, telling them how much you appreciate them, I think you can often at least make some headway. Getting them to stick around even without necessarily getting an immediate raise. Okay, so again, there are exceptions. Hopefully you guys can understand where we're coming from there. It's at least a potential problem to just give raises to employees who threaten to leave. The managers do it not infrequently. Another example is to reward activity instead of productivity. Another common managerial error. Managers themselves are busy. You read the article by Mintzberg about how frantic and fast-paced and busy a manager's job is. What managers often do, because they kind of lose track about who's really being productive, is reward the people who appear to be productive. In other words, rewarding activity, rewarding the people who look busy. Breaking a sweat, running around, carrying a computer printout. That person might not be doing anything. Right? That could be the Herman Shell of the workplace. Remember? Guy just standing around, just not doing anything because he looks busy. So a common mistake to reward activity instead of productivity. Rewarding those who complain the most. We already gave that. I gave an example of that. Rewarding conformity rather than creativity. Another common one where managers will talk as if they want people to be creative. I'm sure you've heard managers say this. Hey, I want you to buck the system. I want you to challenge what we're doing around here. Be the devil's advocate, right? Say something different to shake things up. And so that they claim that they want their employees to do that, when in fact, from a behavioral standpoint, what the managers often do is punish people to do that. Right? They'll knock people down, knock down their ideas, otherwise punish them for doing exactly what they asked them to do, and instead rewarding the head bobber, right? The person who just sort of goes along, the yes man, so to speak, just kind of goes along with whatever the manager is saying. So, unfortunately, all too common to reward conformity instead of rewarding creativity. A big problem, some point to this is being at least one of the driving forces behind our current mess that we're in as an economy is rewarding the generation of short-term profits rather than good, sound, long-term strategy. You see a lot of that in the workplace. So with these kinds of examples, kind of the point is that people, despite the fact that yes, reinforcement theory is simple, yes, it's very powerful. The things that get rewarded are the things that get done in organizations. We're beginning to get into part 3, which is how difficult it is to use reinforcement theory in practice. And these are examples of sort of the misapplication of reinforcement theory, where managers, no doubt have good intentions, they want to reward certain things, but they end up rewarding a whole set of different things. Right? Here's another example of this kind of from my own personal life, just to shake things up a little bit. I've got a friend, a couple. My wife and I are pretty close friends with this other couple, and I'll probably get some other examples from them because they're very interesting people later in class. But the idea of this story is that the man often complains to me. The man in the other couple often complains to me. He says his wife nags him all the time. Complains about it frequently, about how much he gets nagged. Now, in terms of how much I've observed, maybe she does it more behind the scenes. I haven't observed a whole lot of nagging, but I'll take him at his word that he says that she nags him all the time. What I think is interesting is what he does. The few times I have seen her nag him, so to speak, and again, not common, but a couple of times, what he does is that, at least in my is that he so despises nagging, he so can't stand being nagged, that the moment he perceives himself being nagged, he'll instantly give in and do whatever it is that she's, getting on with him. Same kind of thing here. What's he doing? Right? Yeah, he is creating the exact world that he's trying to avoid. Right? If you're, someone is nagging you, so to speak, and you just give in to them and do whatever they're saying, you're rewarding them for nagging, right? So you shouldn't be surprised if you find that behavior continuing. So, again, an example about how reinforcement theory is pretty simple in concept. People do what's rewarded, they don't do what's punished. But it's powerful. People do the things that are rewarded, yet it's difficult to use in real life. There's all these kinds of examples suggest. And I bet you can think of examples in your own life if you really kind of, apply some self-criticism about things that you do. That basically rewards the wrong kinds of behaviors. We're all guilty of it, myself included. So this is getting us into this, again, this third topic. It's so difficult to use reinforcement theory in practice. And so why don't I go ahead and turn to you guys for the article that I asked you to read for today, which certainly is right on this topic, right? It's the folly of rewarding A while hoping for B. Can someone get us started? What are some examples that article brings out in terms of where, that's not just in management. There's some management-related examples of the article, but kind of in life in general. Where do we see, the misapplication of reinforcement theory going on? Can someone give us an example from the article?
Just the first one would be politics.
Okay.
Politicians in their campaign, when they're trying to be elected, they're going to focus on the overall goals.
Yes.
Rather than the specifics, because that's in the election.
Right. And people moan about it all the time, right? Why aren't our politicians being specific? Why don't they ever, allow themselves to be pinned down? Right?
It's only after those who go in with one of the specifics, that's the other.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Right? And so we see it frequently in politics where we actually reward people, who run for office for being very general. We punish them for being specific. Right? We reward A while hoping for B. Good. Other examples from the article. Yes.
Insurance companies that reward employees who don't get complaints against them. They don't get complaints because they just pay out any claims that come in and don't question them, and so no one can complain. And so they're paying out more money, but they're rewarding those employees for doing it.
Great. Yeah, a very good organization, company-related example of rewarding A while hoping for B, the insurance company. What else? Other examples from the article? I know you guys have read it, but I want to keep these around as a group because I think that they're worth bringing back up. Go ahead.
The word example related to work or one example, and where they all want basically look at the same result, but it's just people they all want to go home, but in one case they're literally you go home with the other one is their chore.
Yeah, exactly right. And there's some other sort of war-related examples that we could bring up, but that's a good sound one from the article. The tour of the idea versus the goal of finishing the task. Be careful about what you reward, right? Just some people focusing on finishing what you review. Other examples from the article. I want to get personal examples from you guys in a minute, but let's just do some more from the article. Please, yeah.
The University of Hamburg.
Yes.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Others that are focused on their teaching or researching
Absolutely, right? One that's near and dear to my heart, right? And you guys as students, as you pointed out. Yeah, I mean, do we all want good teaching? Right? Of course we do. Everybody wants good teaching, right? But as you guys know, my undergraduates often don't know this, but you guys are sophisticated enough to know that people like me are rewarded not for teaching, not at all. The reward is for research, right? So, that's what your professors tend to focus on, unfortunately, at least many of them, is the research side of their job, because that's where the rewards come from. And then is it any wonder that people end up getting such a variable experience in the classroom? Some professors who, try to do a good job in the classroom, mainly just out of a sense of professional obligation, but this is what I think I ought to be doing, even if there are no rewards for it. For those who are more sort of reward focused, chasing the rewards, unfortunately, have more of a tendency to blow off their teaching. on the research side of things. So, yeah, a great example, right, that we all see evidence of. We'll probably rewarding A while hoping for B at a university. Yeah, and for B, chainsaw to the system, right? Try to figure out some way to reward teachers more effectively. Yeah, other examples from Europe. There's some other interesting ones in there. Christina's on a roll. That's good. No, it's great. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, it's good.
Another one I like is getting the finance by it and the grades, how we're rewarded in our program.
Yeah, the rewarding grades as opposed to things like learning, right? And maybe we try to reward learning. Yeah, I mean, again, a problem with the system where there's, I'll take responsibility for that to some degree also. It's difficult to do, but certainly we can all do a better job of trying to reward what really matters, more like learning. So let's focus on grades. Yeah. Other examples? Yes.
When the doctor will determine that a person who's well is sick, but they don't want to go the other way.
Yeah.
Saying somebody's sick is actually, well,
Yeah. Yeah.
because by saying somebody who's sick is well, I mean, they would get less business, and then I guess the way they proceed you would not be effective.
Exactly right. And so, it's one of the explanations for things like, the ineffectiveness of antibiotics, right? Doctors have a real incentive built into the system to treat people who are basically well, treat them as if they're sick. They're spreading out, someone comes in with a sniffle or even just, mentions the word antibiotic, you go ahead and write the prescription. Before you know it,
Oh, right, that's in their head too, all the time.
Yeah.
They don't know if they're sick, they're still gonna get well. Psychologically.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So an interesting example from the medical. Some other ones. I guess you guys are not necessarily looking to give other examples, so I can go ahead and move on. But orphanages. There's an interesting example in there about orphanages and other business-related examples. But you guys get the idea. Again, very common problem. Let me give you guys an opportunity though to maybe give any personal examples that you might have about the difficulties of reinforcement theory. If you think about your own work experience, where maybe you saw people engaging in behaviors that, they really shouldn't have been engaging in, it could be, even into the world of unethical or illegal behaviors. People are doing those kinds of things. Chances are outstanding that the reward system is supporting it, right? They're being rewarded for it. Do managers want their employees doing unethical and illegal things? Sometimes, but generally, I think you guys are out there managing, and you're presumably not going to want your employees doing unethical or illegal things, but you might reward it, right? Inadvertently. So what are some examples maybe you guys can think of from your own experience? Wrong behavior is getting rewarded for those things.
Just from when I was teaching, it seemed like there was kind of an 80-20 rule there. The kids that caused 20% of the problems got 80% of the attention.
Yeah.
And I always felt bad because, the kids who were doing good couldn't get the attention that they deserved because these other kids, I would have to keep that in mind to keep the class under control.
Yeah.
And so, it's, a flaw in the system, but there wasn't much I could do about it.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, as I'm sure you're aware, you see the same problem in business organizations, right? Where managers, unfortunately, all too often spend way too much time on their least productive employees, and they kind of ignore their stars. Stars kind of self-manage, take care of themselves, and they don't give those people enough attention. They don't give them the training that they want, maybe to move to the next level. Opportunities to learn more about other sides of the business, because they're spending way too much time on the people who are demanding their time. The 80-20 problem, as you accurately defined. So we see it in the schools, we see it in the workplace for sure. Other examples? Anyone?
I got picked out the need for being a single mom, even though I had a girl evaluation, and there were guys who were computer guys and kept getting in trouble and having snacks and stuff, who just by virtue of the fact that they didn't have a child, that were, their board had been well evaluated and constantly in trouble.
I have something of a sales background myself. I can certainly relate to a lot of that. You know, when you walk into a retail store, not all that uncommon to see examples of retail employees, lying to customers, tripping over each other to make sales, and then stepping over each other to make sales, doing whatever they can to get that commission and commission-based reward system. So yeah, I mean, that's just a treasure trove of examples of where the wrong behaviors unfortunately end up being rewarded. Good. Any others?
I was going to build on that. I'm in fundraising, and I've actually had a boss who was very, there's two different terms that you use. Very relationship oriented or very school oriented. And he was very much like push the gift envelope with people, where they would make a gift, but then that relationship was completely disintegrated.
Yeah.
Whereas, and so that's all he was focused on, was just making that gift, but then after he left, we had to repatch all of these relationships that he destroyed.
Good. Another good example. Yeah. Yeah. And so, I'm going to leave it there. I don't want to, totally beat this to death any more than I am, but, point being, we see just tons of examples, right, in business and in life of where people end up rewarding the wrong kinds of behaviors. Not always easy to fix, but the first step is basically awareness, right? Just trying to do what you can as a manager to try to talk to people. Exit interviews, I found are a good way to be able to learn about what's really rewarded in your company, as those salespeople are turning over, providing you have a good relationship with them. Yeah, talk to them, do some interviewing and find out, are some of the wrong kinds of behaviors being rewarded in this company? What might we do to try to, realign our reward system more appropriately to reward the right kinds of behaviors and not the wrong kinds of behaviors? So, it's kind of step one, awareness, and step two, information gathering, figure out, what's going on. And then once you know, often it's easier to take appropriate steps to try to realign the system. It's often easier said than done, but not often too difficult. A big part of it is just being more aware as a manager of what's going on, what's really being rewarded and what's not. So good. That's reinforcement theory, right? Simple, it's powerful, it's difficult to use in real life, so just please be aware of the difficulties that we described. Questions about reinforcement theory? Most of them okay? That's just one approach, right? One very powerful and useful approach, I think, is to use reinforcement principles in the workplace. What we're starting now is a very different category. It can be connected to reinforcement theory, but really a different world. What we're stepping into now are what are called need-based approaches to motivation, right? And here we're trying to, as the name implies, use the concept of human needs in order to motivate people. Almost any discussion of need-based approaches begins with Maslow. I don't feel any great need to discuss Maslow in detail because I'm sure you guys have been exposed to Maslow 500, 600, 700 times in your life. If you never have, please feel free to come talk to me or look it up on the web. You can get an easy discussion of Maslow's hierarchy. So given that I'm going to kind of walk into this with an assumption that you guys have learned about Maslow at some point, let me ask you a related question. Often people learn Maslow's hierarchy without understanding how you can actually use it as a manager. So let me ask you guys that question. How can you actually use Maslow's hierarchy to motivate people?
I think it comes back to the whole idea of self-efficacy. Like when people feel as if they know that they're doing a good job and they understand what they need to be doing and how to get there by placing off of like this self-esteem needs and making sure that their safety needs and all that stuff is fulfilled. I think it's very rare that people get to self-actualization, but playing off of that self-esteem needs and knowing that they know that they're doing a good job can greatly motivate a person.
Good. All right. Good thought. Other thoughts about actually using Maslow's hierarchy to motivate?
You just work your way up the pyramid and seeing what people need. Like at first they're just going to need a job. They just need money to put a roof over their head.
Okay.
And then, they're going to want to perform well in that job, so you hit up the esteem, and then they're going to want to be recognized in front of other people, so you recognize them. You just work your way up and motivate them. Because offering somebody who needs social respect, offering more money isn't gonna motivate them anymore. You're gonna need to give them that. So.
Okay, good, yeah, so while recognizing, of course, that most people don't progress very quickly, right, maybe
Yeah.
years, as someone
Yeah.
moves from one level to one next. Yeah, step one, as you're suggesting, is kind of to identify what people need, right? And let me just pause there and say, well, how do you know what people need? Managers make assumptions all the time, right? We call that projection, or we just kind of assume that other people are just like us, make a mistake in management because people are not like you, for the most part. So how do you find out? How do you know what people need?
You can respond to people's reaction, or pay attention to people's reactions, you know. If they, and they're good, you can sit down and talk with them about how do they like their job, what could go better if they talk about, I need money, or, you know, hey, I really appreciate you sitting down and mentoring me, you know, or when you give them feedback on something, if they respond off of possible feedback, then you know that they really respond well to something.
Okay, good, right? So just being aware, right? Just keeping your ears open and paying attention to what people talk about, what they seem to focus on, can help you forward that answer. How else can you find out what people need?
I think you want to have, in your quarterly reviews or just check-ins, you want to, usually have like a 30-day one with a new employee, and then after that you start doing like quarterly usually, and just, talking to them and seeing what they need, what they want, asking them, like,
Ask them.
You straight up just ask them, what are you looking to get out of this? Like, how's everything going?
Right? Ask them.
Yeah.
Right? Basically a rhetorical question for you guys. How many of you have had managers who've ever asked? See some hands, right? But I bet a lot of you, and even those of you who raise your hand, I bet you've had other managers who never asked. In my experience, at least relatively uncommon for managers to ever ask, right? Now, keep in mind, of course, that that's a pretty sensitive topic, right? You've got to use, good communication skills, to be appropriately sensitive as you begin to, try to find out what people actually want. But often, whether it's just a good relationship building, or you feel comfortable talking to someone about that, or even just, anonymous, there are anonymous ways basically of pulling your employees to find out what it is people are looking for. Why not be the kind of manager who actually takes the time to find a way to find out without hopefully being offensive, without being in your employee's face, but to find out what they want. And that was something that Jeff was like, part of your answer. Yeah, find out. Yeah. Ask them.
Feel testful.
Okay, there you go.
Acknowledge, and go out, be seeking, go out and say things to them in front of people. Just be responsible to that. See how that improves job performance. That does make a mark.
Okay.
Keep building on that.
A little experimenting. Okay, yeah, good. Okay, fine. Yeah. Right. Okay, yeah, so employee satisfaction surveys are another technique that managers can use to find out what it is their employees actually want and need. So, that seems so obvious, to find out what people want and need. But again, I want to ask you guys to think about your experience, and I bet many of you have had many experiences where you worked for an organization for some long period of time, and your managers never really bothered to figure out what it is that you were looking for. What do you really need and want? And so please don't be that kind of manager, right? Be the kind of manager who does try to find a sensitive, appropriate way to find out what people actually want. And so then once you do that, right, there are basically two ways of using Maslow's hierarchy. We can just kind of wrap this up by saying, you can maybe think of more, but two basic ways of using Maslow's hierarchy. The first way is to link it to reinforcement theory, which is pretty much what Evan was talking about before, right? Well, okay, now I know what my employees want and need. I can use reinforcement theory. So to basically make that contract with my employees. Say, okay, look, it's clear to me, you may not say it quite this way, but you basically say, it's clear to me that you were, looking to get a promotion, to get a raise, whatever it is that you're looking for. Let me make a pledge to you as your manager that provided you do X, Y, and Z, over the next year or whatever time period you're focusing on, I pledge to do whatever I can as a manager to help you get that promotion, to give you that raise, whatever it is that your employee seems to be looking for. So that's not surprising, but that's one way that you can use Maslow's hierarchy. We call it kind of the after the fact approach, right? Provided they do the right kinds of behaviors, you respond as a manager by helping them satisfy their needs, right? After the fact, after they do the right kinds of behaviors. The second way you can basically use Maslow's hierarchy is kind of a before, it's sort of a before the fact approach, beforehand. And what I mean by that is that lots of companies like Google, the video that we saw earlier, will try to take steps to satisfy people's needs before they even walk in the door. It's not contingent on condition, right? Like approach number one. Approach number two, you're saying you're trying to do what you can to satisfy your employees' needs before they walk into the workplace. So, for example, places like Google, will try to do what they can to take care of people's basic physiological needs, to give them a good salary, to try to make them not worry about physiological needs primarily through the use of salary. At the safety level, and that includes things like fringe benefits, where people know they've got a good medical plan, they've got a good dental plan, they've got a good retirement plan, they've got child care access, for the parents who are worried about whether their kids are going to be safe, having an otherwise safe work environment. You take care of that stuff up front. And the logic here, of course, is that provided you can take care of these kinds of things up front, your employees aren't going to be thinking about that. They're going to be focusing on their job. They'll be more motivated and able to do their job, basically. And they're not worrying about whether my child is safe, at a good daycare. They're not worried about whether they're going to be able to pay those medical bills, because they've got that covered, right? So especially for your employees who are kind of at some of those lower levels, the more you can take care of those needs up front, the more of a motivated employee from the standpoint of them being work focused, focusing on what they have to do at work, you tend to have it. So hope those make sense. These are the two basic ways you use Maslow's hierarchy. Rewards after the behavior occurs, or trying to satisfy the needs up front, if they can focus on their job. And presumably be more motivated because they appreciate at some level what the organization is trying to do for them. Okay, does that make sense? A couple of other just quick things about Maslow before we move on. Just please be aware that there's research suggesting that Maslow's hierarchy is culture specific. It doesn't get talked about in discussions of Maslow. But basically the concept of a hierarchy appears to be pretty universal. Right? The logic of Maslow that you kind of focus on lower level needs before you try to work your way up to higher level needs, that appears to be true in any country. What's not universal is the content of each one of these boxes. Right? For example, in some Asian nations, research suggests that the top level is not really what we call self-actualization. That's kind of to some degree, more of a Western concept. That the top of the hierarchy, at least in certain Asian countries, would look more like the social level. Kind of after you satisfy every other need, you can sort of focus on cultivating good relationships with others. That would be more kind of the top of the hierarchy. So again, hierarchy is pretty universal. What's inside these boxes is pretty country specific. So please don't assume that this graphic you're seeing up here applies in all countries. It absolutely does not. This is fairly U.S., Western Europe kind of areas. Not going to be applicable in all countries. The other quick point I want to make before we leave is to point out that as a manager, I mentioned projection a minute ago, where you sort of assume that other people have the same, traits, characteristics, things that you have. Please don't forget that when you're managing, if you look 10 years down the road, you guys are maybe middle, upper level managers in companies. You may well be focusing on things like esteem, self-actualization, or whatever, because you've walked through the hierarchy. Please don't forget that you're going to have any number of employees who are still down here, and they may not be obvious to you. People can be making very good salaries and still be at that basic physiological level. Worried about whether they're going to be able to pay the rent, worried about whether they're going to be able to put food on the table, right? Whether they're going to be able to pay their heating bill. And that can be for a lot of reasons. Or people can keep up bills because of bad financial management. They can be paying off student loans. They might have a sick relative who doesn't have insurance. All their money is going to someone's health care. There are tons of reasons why someone might be making a nice salary. They might look presentable. They might not otherwise look like whatever someone might look like. It's a stereotype, but whatever someone might look like who's at that level, they might fool you. But be aware, right, that you will likely have any number of employees who are still at these sort of basic levels, and don't forget about that, even if you are someone who's at a higher level. Basically, another way of saying, just try to avoid the trap of projection as a manager. Don't assume other people are at the same level as you. Realize that people will fall across any number of these levels. And by the way, what is the major motivator for someone who is at that basic physiological level? Money. Absolutely money, right? And so we're going to begin on Tuesday by talking about actually how for most people money is not a very good motivator, but it is the motivator for someone who's at that basic physiological level. Right? So more on that on Tuesday. Stay tuned. Please bring this sheet back. We'll continue on need-based approaches on Tuesday. And otherwise, have a great weekend. See you guys later.
Oh, okay.